It was just another Tuesday morning in Memphis, Tennessee. The sun was already beating down hard by 9 o'clock, making the sidewalks shimmer with heat. Downtown was busy as usual, with cars honking, people rushing to work, and the smell of coffee drifting from the corner cafe. In the middle of all this, a woman named Keisha Morrison was parking her car near the big courthouse building. She was 42 years old, worked as an elementary school teacher, and was a mom to 2 beautiful kids. Today was supposed to be simple. She had a court hearing about custody arrangements with her ex-husband. Nothing major, just some paperwork and talking to the judge. At least that's what she thought. Keisha checked herself in the rearview mirror one more time. She'd picked out her best professional outfit, a navy blue blazer and matching pants. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She wanted to look responsible, put together. This hearing mattered so much to her. Her kids meant everything, and she needed the judge to see that she was a good mother. She grabbed her brown leather folder from the passenger seat. Inside were all her documents, report cards showing her kids' good grades, letters from their teachers, proof of her steady job. She'd spent weeks organizing everything perfectly. Her hands were a little sweaty as she held the folder tight. Walking toward the courthouse, Keisha took deep breaths. The building was huge, with tall white columns and stone steps leading up to the entrance. People were flowing in and out. Lawyers with briefcases, families holding hands nervously, security officers in uniform standing at attention. The security checkpoint was just inside the main doors. There was a metal detector and an X-ray machine for bags, just like at the airport. 2 officers were managing the line, checking IDs and making sure everyone went through properly. Keisha placed her purse and folder on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector. It beeped, and for a second her heart jumped. But the officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, just smiled and asked her to step back. "Just your belt buckle, honey," the officer said warmly. "Try again without leaning forward." Keisha walked through again, and this time it stayed quiet. The officer handed back her things with a nod. "Have a good day, ma'am. Courtroom numbers are on the board over there." "Thank you," Keisha replied softly, managing a small smile despite her nerves. She made her way through the marble hallway. Her shoes clicked against the polished floor. The courthouse was impressive inside, with high ceilings and big windows letting in streams of light. But it also felt cold, intimidating. The weight of justice and law hung heavy in the air. Other people passed by her, all caught up in their own legal battles. A young couple arguing quietly in Spanish, an older man in a wheelchair being pushed by his daughter, 2 lawyers in expensive suits talking about strategy as they walked. Keisha found the directory board and scanned it quickly. Courtroom 4B, 3rd floor. She headed to the elevators, her stomach doing little flips. She'd been to court before during her divorce, but it never got easier. The waiting, the uncertainty, the feeling that your whole life was being judged by strangers. What Keisha didn't notice, what she couldn't have noticed, was one particular security officer watching the morning crowd. His name was Officer Derek Hastings, and he'd worked courthouse security for 20 years. He was stationed near the main entrance, supposedly keeping an eye on things, but something was different about him lately. His uniform was still crisp and professional, his badge still shiny. But if you looked closely at his eyes, really looked, you'd see something wasn't right. They were distant, unfocused. His jaw was clenched tight, and his hand kept drifting down to his service weapon on his hip, touching it, checking it over and over. His co-workers had noticed small things over the past few weeks. He'd snapped at someone for asking a simple question. He'd been late twice, which never happened before. He'd been quieter than usual, keeping to himself during breaks instead of joining the usual coffee talk. But nobody said anything. People get stressed. Life happens. Everyone just figured he was going through something and would bounce back. After all, he'd been doing this job for 2 decades without a single serious incident. Hastings watched Keisha pass through security, his eyes tracking her as she walked toward the elevators. There was nothing special about this moment, nothing that would have caught anyone's attention. Just a routine morning at the courthouse, another person heading to another hearing. Keisha stepped into the elevator with a few other people. As the doors closed, she checked her phone one last time. A text from her sister. "You got this. Call me after. Love you." It made her smile. She typed back a quick heart emoji and put her phone on silent. The elevator dinged at the 3rd floor. Keisha stepped out and followed the signs to courtroom 4B. The hallway was quieter up here, with wooden benches lining the walls where people sat waiting for their cases to be called. Some were reading papers, others staring at their phones, a few just staring at nothing. She found a spot on a bench outside her courtroom and sat down carefully, smoothing her blazer. Her lawyer was supposed to meet her here at 9:30. She glanced at her watch. 9:20. Good, she was early. A janitor pushed a cart past, the wheels squeaking slightly. Somewhere down the hall, a baby was crying. Normal sounds of a normal day. Keisha opened her folder and started reviewing her notes one more time, even though she'd practically memorized them by now. It gave her something to do with her nervous energy. At 9:25, her lawyer arrived. Ms. Patricia Chen was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in family law. She'd been recommended by a friend, and Keisha trusted her completely. "Morning, Keisha. You ready?" Patricia asked, sitting down beside her. "As ready as I'll ever be," Keisha replied, trying to sound confident. They went over a few last-minute details. What the judge might ask, how to answer clearly and calmly. Don't get emotional. Even if the other side tries to provoke you, stick to the facts. At 9:30 exactly, the courtroom doors opened. A bailiff, Officer Thomas Wilson, poked his head out and called several case numbers, including Keisha's. She stood up, took one final deep breath, and walked into the courtroom. It looked exactly like courtrooms do on TV, but somehow more real and more intimidating. The judge's bench was at the front, raised up high. The witness stand was to the side. Rows of benches for observers. The state seal on the wall. Her ex-husband was already there with his lawyer, sitting at the opposite table. They didn't make eye contact. The judge hadn't come in yet. Keisha sat down next to Patricia at their table and tried to steady her breathing. This was it. The moment she'd been preparing for. Everything was going to be fine. She'd present her case. The judge would see she was a good mother, and they'd work out a fair arrangement. She had no idea that in less than an hour, her entire world would explode into violence and chaos. No idea that she'd be fighting not for custody of her children, but for her very life. The morning sun continued streaming through the courtroom windows. Outside, birds chirped in the trees. Traffic hummed in the distance. Just another ordinary Tuesday in Memphis. But ordinary was about to become extraordinary in the worst possible way. Judge Patricia Wells entered the courtroom at exactly 9:45. Everyone stood as she came in, her black robe flowing behind her. She was a woman in her early 60s with gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She'd been a family court judge for 15 years and had seen just about everything. "Please be seated," she said in a firm but not unkind voice. Everyone sat back down. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Keisha's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The judge shuffled some papers, put on her glasses, and looked up. Case number 2024 FC 8847, Morrison versus Morrison, custody modification hearing. I've reviewed both submissions. We'll hear from the petitioner first. Keisha's ex-husband's lawyer stood up. His name was Robert Daniels, and he was the kind of lawyer who wore expensive suits and spoke in a smooth, confident voice that made everything sound more important than it was. "Your Honor, my client is seeking primary custody of the minor children based on significant concerns about the home environment provided by Ms. Morrison." Keisha felt her chest tighten. This was already starting badly. For the next 20 minutes, she had to sit there and listen as this lawyer painted her as an unfit mother. He talked about how she worked long hours, how the kids were sometimes late to school, how one of them had fallen and gotten stitches on her watch. He made it sound like she was neglectful, careless, like her children weren't safe with her. None of it was fair. Yes, she worked, but she had to. She was a single mother. Yes, her daughter had been late to school a few times, but only because of car trouble. And the stitches? That was from her son climbing a tree in the backyard. Kids get hurt sometimes, that's just life. But sitting there listening to it all twisted and presented in the worst possible light, Keisha felt herself getting angry. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. Her jaw clenched. She wanted to jump up and scream that it was all lies, all out of context. Patricia, her lawyer, put a gentle hand on her arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. When it was finally their turn, Patricia stood and presented Keisha's side. She showed the report cards, the letters from teachers praising both children. She pointed out that Keisha had never missed a parent-teacher conference, that she volunteered in their classrooms, that both kids were happy, healthy, and thriving. Then it was time for Keisha to speak. The judge asked her some questions directly. "Ms. Morrison, can you explain the tardiness issues your ex-husband's counsel mentioned?" Keisha stood up, her legs a little shaky. "Your Honor, my car broke down twice last semester. I was having transmission problems. As soon as I could afford it, I got it fixed. The kids were only late 4 times total, and I called the school every time to let them know." "And you're currently employed full-time?" "Yes, ma'am. I teach 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary. I've been there for 12 years. The questioning continued. Keisha tried to answer everything clearly and honestly, but then the ex-husband's lawyer stood up again. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to point out that Ms. Morrison has had difficulty maintaining stable childcare arrangements. In the past year alone, she's gone through 3 different babysitters. That did it." That just wasn't true, and Keisha couldn't stay quiet anymore. "That's not accurate," she said, her voice rising. "1 babysitter moved away for a new job. 1 got married and stopped babysitting for everyone, not just me. And the 3rd I actually kept for 8 months until she went back to college." "Ms. Morrison, please," the judge said calmly. "Your attorney can respond." But Keisha was frustrated now, really frustrated. Months of stress and worry and being made to feel like a bad mother were bubbling up. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I can't sit here and let him make me sound like some irresponsible person who doesn't care about her kids. They are my whole world. Everything I do is for them." Her voice had gotten louder. She wasn't yelling, but she was definitely not speaking in the calm, measured tone her lawyer had told her to use. Officer Thomas Wilson, the bailiff standing near the judge's bench, took a step forward. "Ma'am, you need to lower your voice." "I'm sorry," Keisha said, but her voice was still shaky with emotion. "I'm sorry, this is so unfair." "Ms. Morrison," Judge Wells said firmly, "I understand this is emotional for you, but you need to compose yourself. I'm going to call a 15-minute recess. Use that time to calm down. We'll reconvene and finish this hearing with appropriate courtroom decorum. Understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Keisha said quietly, feeling embarrassed now. She sat back down, her face hot. The judge stood and everyone else stood too. 15 minutes, she said, and then she disappeared through the door behind her bench. People started moving around, some leaving the courtroom to stretch their legs, others staying in their seats. Keisha's ex-husband and his lawyer stepped out into the hallway. Keisha stayed put, feeling like she might cry. "Hey," Patricia said gently beside her. "You're okay. Just breathe. That wasn't as bad as you think. The judge has seen way worse." Keisha nodded, trying to pull herself together. She opened her folder and pretended to look at her papers, even though she wasn't really seeing them. She was just trying to calm down, trying to get her heart rate back to normal. There were still about a dozen people scattered around the courtroom. Some were waiting for later cases. A few were probably just observers or law students watching proceedings. Officer Wilson was standing near the door. Everything seemed normal. But in the back corner near the far wall, Officer Derek Hastings had entered the courtroom. Nobody had really noticed him come in. He wasn't supposed to be there. He usually worked the main entrance downstairs. But nobody thought anything of it. Officers moved around the building all the time. Hastings stood very still, his back against the wall, watching. His hand was resting on his duty belt, fingers just inches from his service weapon. His eyes were locked on Keisha. There was something wrong with the way he was staring. It wasn't the professional, alert gaze of a security officer. It was intense, focused, almost predatory. His breathing was shallow and quick. His jaw muscles were working, clenching and unclenching. But Keisha didn't see him. She was facing forward, still looking down at her papers, still trying to compose herself. Patricia was checking messages on her phone. Officer Wilson was looking at his watch, probably timing the 15-minute recess. The courtroom was quiet now. Just the sound of people shifting in their seats, someone coughing, papers rustling. Outside in the hallway, muffled voices and footsteps. Hastings took a step forward. Then another, moving slowly, deliberately, his right hand now hovering directly over his weapon. His eyes never leaving Keisha's back. Still, nobody noticed. Why would they? He was a cop in uniform in a courthouse. He belonged there. He had every right to be in that courtroom. 3 more steps. He was maybe 20 feet away from her now. Patricia glanced up from her phone and happened to look toward the back of the courtroom. For just a split second, her eyes met Hastings's. Something in his expression made her pause. Something wasn't right. But before she could process what she was seeing, Before she could say anything or do anything, Hastings' hand moved to his holster. The moment stretched out, everything moving in slow motion. Patricia's eyes widening, her mouth starting to open, her brain screaming danger but her body not yet responding. And Keisha, completely unaware, still sitting there trying to calm her nerves, thinking about her children, thinking about what she'd say when court resumed, thinking about everything except the threat moving toward her from behind. The 15-minute recess had barely started. There were still 13 minutes left before the judge would return, and the hearing would continue. 13 minutes that should have been uneventful. 13 minutes that were about to change everything. Hastings' fingers curled around the grip of his service weapon. In the quiet courtroom, the sound of the safety snap being released was like a thunderclap. That's when Patricia finally found her voice. "Gun!" she screamed. The single word "gun" split the air like lightning. Everything happened at once, and yet somehow in terrible, crystal-clear slow motion.
Keisha's head whipped around toward the sound of Patricia's scream.
Her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. A police officer, a uniform, but his weapon was drawn, pointed, at her. Time seemed to stop. In that frozen moment, Keisha saw everything with impossible clarity. The fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished barrel of the gun. The blank, almost absent look in the officer's eyes, like he wasn't really there, like he was somewhere else entirely, the way his finger was already on the trigger. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Some ancient survival instinct kicked in. She started to move, to duck, to get away, but she was sitting down, trapped between the table in front of her and the chair beneath her. The first shot exploded through the courtroom like a bomb. The sound was impossibly loud, so loud it felt physical, like being punched in the chest. Keisha felt the bullet pass by her, felt the air move. Wood exploded right next to her. The edge of the table where her hands had been just a second ago splintered into a shower of fragments. A chunk the size of her fist just disintegrated. People started screaming. Real, primal screams of pure terror. Keisha threw herself sideways, finally getting her body to respond. She hit the floor hard, her shoulder slamming into the polished wood. Pain shot through her arm, but she barely felt it. Adrenaline was flooding her system, making everything sharp and bright and terrifying. The second shot came immediately after the first. This one found her. She felt the impact before she heard the sound. Her shoulder exploded in white-hot pain, a burning, tearing sensation that made her cry out. The bullet had caught her in the upper left shoulder, tearing through muscle and tissue before exiting out the back. She was hit. She was actually shot. The realization was so surreal, so impossible, that her brain almost couldn't accept it. This didn't happen. This couldn't be happening. Not in a courthouse. Not in a room full of people. Not to her. Blood immediately started soaking through her blazer, spreading dark and warm across the fabric. She pressed her right hand to the wound instinctively, feeling the hot wetness seeping between her fingers. The courtroom had become absolute chaos. People were diving under benches, crawling toward exits, screaming, crying. A woman near the back was frozen in place, just standing there with her hands over her mouth, too terrified to move. An older man had fallen trying to run and was crawling toward the door on his hands and knees. "Get down. Everybody down!" Someone was yelling. Officer Wilson, the bailiff, had been standing near the judge's bench when the first shot rang out. For a critical second, he'd been frozen too, his brain refusing to accept that another officer was shooting. But training kicked in. He launched himself toward Hastings, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Hastings swung the gun toward Wilson now, but his movements were slow, almost dreamlike. Whatever was happening in his head, whatever break from reality he was experiencing, it had slowed his reactions. Wilson crashed into him like a linebacker, wrapping both arms around Hastings's torso and driving him backward. They slammed into the wall together, hard enough to knock the breath from both of them. Wilson grabbed for the gun hand, trying to control the weapon. They struggled, both of them grunting with effort. Hastings was strong, stronger than Wilson had expected, and he had the desperate energy of someone not fully in their right mind. For several terrifying seconds, the gun swung wildly between them, pointing at the ceiling, at the floor, at the people still scrambling for safety. "Drop it!" Wilson shouted right in Hastings' face. "Drop the weapon!" But Hastings didn't respond. His eyes were still vacant, unfocused. It was like he couldn't hear or couldn't understand, like he was trapped inside his own head, acting out some nightmare that only he could see. The third shot went off during their struggle. The gun was pointed upward when Hastings's finger squeezed the trigger again. The bullet punched through one of the acoustic tiles in the ceiling, and dust and debris rained down on them. More screaming, more chaos. Wilson finally managed to twist Hastings' wrist at a painful angle, forcing his fingers to open. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding several feet across the polished wood. Wilson immediately kicked it away, sending it spinning under one of the benches. 2 more officers came bursting through the courtroom doors, responding to the shots fired. They saw Wilson wrestling Hastings to the ground and rushed to help. Within seconds, they had Hastings face down on the floor, arms being wrenched behind his back. "I got him! Secure the weapon," Wilson shouted, breathing hard. One of the responding officers dove for the gun, securing it quickly. The other one snapped handcuffs on Hastings' wrists, pulling them tight. Hastings didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just lay there, his cheek pressed against the floor, his eyes open but seeing nothing. His lips were moving slightly like he was talking to himself, but no sound was coming out. But while all this was happening, Keisha was lying on the floor, bleeding. Patricia had crawled over to her during the chaos, pressing her blazer jacket against Keisha's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You're okay. You're going to be okay," Patricia kept saying, though her voice was shaking. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." Keisha's vision was starting to blur. The pain in her shoulder was intense, throbbing with every heartbeat. She could feel blood pooling under her, warm and sticky. Her whole body felt cold despite the warmth of her blood. "My kids," she whispered. "Someone needs to tell my kids." "Shh, don't talk. Save your strength." The courtroom was still in chaos, but a different kind now. The immediate threat was over, but panic was still rippling through everyone. Some people were crying. Others were on their phones calling for help. A few were just sitting on the floor in shock, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Officer Wilson was on his radio, his voice urgent but controlled. "Shots fired in courtroom 4B, 3rd floor. 1 civilian down with gunshot wound to the shoulder. Shooter in custody. Need paramedics immediately. Repeat, need paramedics to courtroom 4B right now." Through the doorway, they could hear pounding footsteps as more officers rushed toward the scene. Someone was shouting to clear the hallway. Another voice was calling for everyone to stay calm. Keisha's eyes were starting to drift closed. The pain was still there, but it seemed further away now, like it was happening to someone else. Everything felt foggy and strange. "Keisha, stay awake. Look at me." Patricia was tapping her face gently, trying to keep her conscious. "Help is coming. Just hold on." The sound of the courtroom seemed to fade in and out. Keisha could hear sirens now coming from somewhere outside, getting closer. She tried to focus on that sound, tried to use it to anchor herself to the present moment. She thought about her children. Her daughter, who was only 9 years old and loved to draw, her son, who was 7 and wanted to be a firefighter when he grew up. They were at school right now, completely unaware that their mother had just been shot. They were probably in class, learning math or reading, living their normal Tuesday. What would they be told? How would they find out? Who would take care of them if something happened to her? "Stay with me, Keisha." Patricia's voice seemed to come from very far away now. Footsteps thundered into the courtroom. New voices, urgent and professional. The paramedics had arrived. Keisha felt hands on her, felt them moving Patricia aside, felt them cutting away her blood-soaked blazer. GSW to the left shoulder through and through. Looks like it missed the subclavian artery, but she's lost a good amount of blood. Medical terms she didn't understand. Hands pressing bandages to her shoulder, front and back. Someone putting an oxygen mask over her face. The cold touch of a blood pressure cuff being wrapped around her arm. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Can you tell me your name?" She tried to answer but couldn't make her mouth work properly. "We're going to take good care of you. You're going to be fine. We're taking you to the hospital right now." She felt herself being lifted, felt the movement as they placed her on a stretcher. The ceiling tiles passed by overhead as they wheeled her out of the courtroom. Everything was blurry and distant behind her. Still face down on the floor in handcuffs, Officer Derek Hastings continued to stare at nothing, his lips still moving in silent conversation with ghosts only he could see. The ordinary Tuesday morning had become a nightmare that nobody in that courtroom would ever forget. The courthouse had transformed from a place of order and justice into a scene of controlled chaos. Within 90 seconds of the shooting, every officer in the building was responding. The main entrance was sealed. Nobody in, nobody out. Emergency protocols that had been practiced but never actually used were suddenly very real. The paramedics wheeled Keisha through the hallway toward the elevators, moving fast but careful not to jostle the stretcher too much. She drifted in and out of awareness. One moment she could hear everything clearly. The rushed footsteps, the radio chatter, someone crying somewhere nearby. The next moment everything would fade to a dull buzz. "Stay with us, Keisha. We're almost to the ambulance," one of the paramedics said. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with kind eyes and steady hands. His name tag said Rodriguez. They got her into the elevator. Patricia was still there, covered in blood that wasn't hers, refusing to leave Keisha's side. She was holding Keisha's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere," Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. The elevator ride down felt like it took forever. Keisha's mind was drifting, floating somewhere between consciousness and sleep. She kept thinking about the strangest things. Did she turn off the coffee maker this morning? What time was parent-teacher conferences next week? Had she signed her son's field trip permission slip? Normal thoughts. Regular life thoughts. Her brain was trying to protect her from the trauma of what just happened by thinking about anything else. The elevator doors opened to more chaos. The ground floor lobby was filled with officers establishing a perimeter, courthouse employees being herded into secure areas, confused civilians demanding to know what was happening. "Make a path. Coming through," Rodriguez shouted, and people scattered to let them pass. The bright sunshine hit Keisha's face as they burst through the main doors. After the artificial light inside, it felt too bright, too real. She squinted against it. The ambulance was waiting right there, back doors open, ready to receive her. They lifted her inside with practiced efficiency. Patricia started to climb in too, but one of the paramedics gently stopped her. "Ma'am, you can't ride along. Family only." "Are you family?" "I'm her lawyer. Please, she needs someone with her." "I'm sorry, we have protocols." "You can meet us at Regional Medical Center. We're taking her there now." Patricia looked torn but nodded. She leaned into the ambulance quickly. "Keisha, I'll be right behind you." "I'm going to call your sister, okay? Everything's going to be fine." Then the doors slammed shut and the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing. Inside the vehicle, the paramedics worked quickly and efficiently. They had done this hundreds of times, but the situation still had an extra edge of tension. A cop shooting a civilian in a courthouse? That wasn't something you saw every day. BP's dropping. 110/60, Rodriguez said, checking his equipment. "Let's get another line in." Keisha felt a pinch in her other arm as they inserted another IV. Cold fluid started flowing into her veins. The oxygen mask was uncomfortable on her face, but she didn't have the energy to adjust it. "Keisha, we're going to give you something for the pain, okay? You're going to feel better in just a minute." She felt the medication hit her system, and the sharp, burning agony in her shoulder started to fade to a dull throb. Her whole body relaxed slightly. But with the pain medication came more drowsiness. Her eyelids felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. "Keep your eyes open, Keisha. Talk to me. Tell me about your family." She tried to respond, but only managed to mumble. "She's got 2 kids, Rodriguez said, checking the information on his tablet that had been relayed from the scene. "Ma'am, tell me about your kids. What are their names?" That got through to her. "Maya," she whispered through the oxygen mask. "And Jordan. Those are beautiful names." "How old are they?" 9 and 7. Bet they're excited that summer's almost here, huh?" She tried to nod, but even that felt like too much effort. The ambulance weaved through traffic, the siren clearing a path. Inside, Rodriguez and his partner kept working, monitoring her vitals, keeping her awake, doing everything they could to make sure she stayed stable until they got to the hospital. Back at the courthouse, a completely different kind of chaos was unfolding. Captain Michael Stevens of the Memphis Police Department had arrived on scene and was trying to piece together what exactly had happened. He stood in courtroom 4B looking at the scene. Blood on the floor, splintered wood from where the first bullet hit, ceiling tile debris from the third shot, evidence markers already being placed by the forensics team. "Someone walk me through this," Stevens said to Officer Wilson, who was still visibly shaken but trying to maintain his composure. Wilson explained everything. The custody hearing, Keisha getting emotional, the recess, and then Hastings appearing out of nowhere and opening fire. Derek Hastings? The same Hastings who's been working here for 20 years? Stevens couldn't believe it. "Yes, sir." "Same one. Where is he now?" "In custody downstairs. He's being held in the security office. "Sir, there's something wrong with him. He's not responding to questions. Just sitting there staring at nothing." Stevens rubbed his face with both hands. This was going to be a nightmare. An officer shooting a civilian in a courthouse? The media was probably already gathering outside. This would be national news by lunchtime. Get him to the hospital under guard. I want a full psychological evaluation. Nobody talks to the press until we have all the facts. Nobody. Am I clear? Yes, sir. The crime scene investigators were taking photographs, measuring distances, documenting everything. Witnesses were being separated and interviewed one by one. Everyone who'd been in that courtroom was giving their statement, and they all said the same thing. The woman did nothing to provoke the attack. Nothing. She was just sitting there when a police officer walked up and tried to kill her. Outside the courthouse, news vans were already starting to arrive. Reporters were setting up cameras, trying to get statements from anyone coming out of the building. Social media was exploding with rumors and speculation. Videos shot on cell phones were already being shared, though most just showed the chaos of people evacuating, not the actual shooting. At Riverside Elementary School, where Keisha taught 3rd grade, her principal was getting a phone call that would change everything. A representative from the court system, trained for these exact situations, was calling to inform them that one of their teachers had been involved in a critical incident. The principal, Mrs. Johnson, felt her blood run cold. Is she alive? Yes, she's being transported to Regional Medical Center now. But we need to know about her children. They're students there. Yes, both of them. Oh my God. Does anyone need to pick them up? We're trying to reach her emergency contacts now. Her sister is listed as primary. Mrs. Johnson was already moving toward her computer, pulling up the files. I'll handle it from this end. Thank you for calling. After hanging up, she just sat there for a moment trying to process. Keisha Morrison, sweet, dedicated Keisha, who stayed late to help struggling students. Keisha, who brought in supplies from her own pocket. Keisha, who always had a smile and a kind word for everyone. Shot. In a courthouse. Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, composed herself, and made the calls she needed to make. Keisha's sister answered on the first ring. At Regional Medical Center, the emergency room had been alerted and was ready. Trauma team assembled, or prepped just in case. When the ambulance pulled up, they were waiting at the bay doors. They wheeled Keisha in fast, transferring her from the ambulance stretcher to a hospital gurney without even breaking stride. A whole team surrounded her immediately. Doctors, nurses, all of them calling out information, taking over from the paramedics. GSW through and through left shoulder, approximately 45 minutes ago. BP stabilized at 115/65. 2 large bore IVs established. Patient's been conscious but drowsy. No signs of pneumothorax. A doctor leaned over Keisha, shining a light in her eyes. Keisha, I'm Dr. Williams. You're at the hospital now. We're going to take excellent care of you. They cut away the rest of her clothes, examining the entry and exit wounds. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation all being monitored constantly. X-rays were taken right there in the trauma bay to check for fractures or bullet fragments. Looks like it missed the major vessels. That's very good news, Dr. Williams said to his team. But we need to check for nerve damage and see how much muscle tissue was compromised. Let's get her up to CT. Everything was moving so fast. Keisha was being wheeled through hallways, through sets of double doors into the CT scanner. The machine hummed and clicked around her. More hallways. More doors. Everyone was efficient, professional, but she could hear the underlying tension in their voices. A cop shooting a woman in court. They all knew what this meant beyond just treating her wounds. This was going to be huge. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only about 45 minutes, Keisha was in a hospital room. The immediate crisis was over. Her wound had been cleaned and properly bandaged. They'd determined she wouldn't need surgery unless complications developed. The bullet had gone clean through, missing bone, missing the major blood vessels and nerves. It would hurt like hell and she'd need physical therapy, but she was going to be okay, physically at least. Within 2 hours of the shooting, 3 separate investigations had been launched. The Memphis Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and the District Attorney's Office all had teams descending on the courthouse, each looking at the incident from different angles. Detective Linda Rodriguez from the TBI was assigned as the lead investigator. She was a veteran with 23 years on the job and a reputation for being thorough and fair. She'd investigated officer-involved shootings before, but this was different. This wasn't a questionable use of force during an arrest or a split-second decision in a dangerous situation. This was a cop walking into a courtroom and shooting an unarmed woman who was just sitting there. The courthouse security footage was the first thing she reviewed. They had multiple cameras covering courtroom 4B from different angles. What Rodriguez saw on those screens made her stomach turn. There was Keisha, sitting at the table next to her lawyer during the recess. Just sitting there looking at papers. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual. Then Hastings entering the courtroom from the back, moving slowly toward her, drawing his weapon, taking aim and firing. The footage was crystal clear. No ambiguity, no question about what happened. Keisha never even saw him until her lawyer screamed. She never had a chance. Rodriguez watched the footage 3 times, taking notes, making sure she wasn't missing anything. But there was nothing to miss. It was exactly what it looked like. An unprovoked attack on a civilian by a uniformed officer. Get me everything on Derek Hastings, she told her team. Work history, personal life, medical records, everything. I want to know what happened to this guy. The investigation started pulling threads, and what they found painted a disturbing picture of warning signs that had been ignored. 3 weeks ago, Hastings' supervisor had noticed him snapping at a visitor who'd asked for directions. Nothing major, just a sharp tone that seemed out of character. The supervisor had made a mental note, but never wrote anything down, never said anything to Hastings about it. 2 weeks ago, a courthouse employee had reported feeling uncomfortable about how Hastings was looking at her. Just staring, for too long. Made me feel weird. She'd mentioned it to a coworker but never filed a formal complaint. 1 week ago, Hastings had been late to work for the first time in 15 years. When asked about it, he'd mumbled something about not sleeping well and moved on. Again, nobody thought much of it. People have bad days. But now, looking back with the clarity of hindsight, Rodriguez could see a pattern. A man falling apart slowly but surely, and nobody catching it until it was too late. The personal information was even more revealing. Hastings was going through a divorce. His wife had filed papers 6 months ago, and it was getting ugly. Fighting over money, over property, over everything. The stress was clearly eating at him. His bank records showed he was in serious debt. Credit cards maxed out, mortgage payments falling behind. He'd taken out a high-interest personal loan just to stay afloat, and the medical records, once they got the warrant for those, showed something even more concerning. 3 months ago, Hastings had gone to his doctor complaining of anxiety, trouble sleeping, racing thoughts. The doctor had prescribed him medication and recommended he see a therapist. Hastings had filled the prescription once. Never refilled it. Never went to the therapist. He just stopped taking his meds, Rodriguez said to her partner, Detective James Monroe. Probably couldn't afford them or didn't want to admit he needed help. And nobody at the department knew? Why would they? He didn't tell anyone. Medical records are private, and there's no mandatory screening for officers after they've been on the job for a while. Monroe shook his head. So a guy who's falling apart mentally, who's armed every single day and nobody's checking on him? That's exactly what happened. They interviewed Hastings' co-workers next. One by one, officers who'd worked alongside him for years came in to give their statements. And the same theme kept coming up. They'd noticed small changes but never thought it was serious. He seemed quieter lately. He stopped coming to lunch with us. Now that you mention it, yeah, he did seem a bit on edge. But none of them had said anything. None of them had reported concerns. Because Hastings was one of them. He was a good cop with a clean record. You don't rat out your own over little things. Except those little things had added up to a woman getting shot. The witness interviews were consistent and heartbreaking. Person after person describing the same scene. A normal court hearing, a woman who'd gotten a bit emotional but nothing extreme. A recess, and then sudden, terrifying violence. One witness, an elderly man who'd been waiting for his own case to be called, broke down crying during his interview. I thought we were all going to die, he said. When that first shot went off, I thought he was going to kill all of us. A young mother who'd been there testified with her voice shaking. My kids were at daycare. All I could think was that I'd never see them again. I was crawling on the floor trying to get to the door, and I could hear more shots, and I just kept thinking about my babies. The psychological toll on the witnesses was enormous. These were people who'd come to court for routine matters and ended up living through a shooting. Many of them would need counseling. Some would probably have PTSD, and at the center of it all was Hastings himself. He'd been transported to a different hospital under heavy guard and was being held in a secure psychiatric ward. The initial evaluation was troubling. The psychiatrist who examined him reported that Hastings was barely responsive. He would answer simple questions with single words, but anything more complex got no response. He stared at walls. He didn't eat unless prompted. When asked why he shot Keisha, he just looked confused, like he didn't understand the question. It's my professional opinion that Mr. Hastings experienced a severe psychotic break, the psychiatrist wrote in her report. He shows signs of complete dissociation from reality. Whether this was triggered by stress, by stopping his medication, or by some other factor is unclear. But he was clearly not in his right mind during the incident. That was going to complicate things legally. If Hastings wasn't mentally competent when he committed the crime, how do you prosecute him? And more importantly, how did someone in his condition still have a badge and a gun? Rodriguez knew those questions would eventually be answered by lawyers and judges. Her job was just to document what happened and why. But she couldn't help feeling angry about the whole situation. This was preventable. If there had been better mental health screening for officers, if there had been a culture where asking for help wasn't seen as weakness, if anyone had taken those warning signs seriously and intervened, but they hadn't, and Keisha Morrison had paid the price. Rodriguez reviewed the evidence one more time. The testimony of dozens of witnesses, the security footage showing everything clearly, the ballistics report confirming all 3 shots came from Hastings' service weapon, the medical records showing his deteriorating mental state, the statements from co-workers describing subtle changes in behavior. It was an airtight case. No question about what happened or who did it. The only question was what would happen next. At the police department, Captain Stevens was dealing with the fallout. The media was going crazy. Reporters were camped outside headquarters demanding answers. Civil rights groups were holding press conferences. The mayor was calling every hour wanting updates, and internally the department was in crisis. Morale was shattered. Officers were questioning whether they could trust their own partners. The public was losing faith in the department's ability to protect them. Stevens held a department-wide meeting that evening. Every officer who could attend was there, filling the main briefing room to capacity. "I know you all have questions," Stevens began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I know you're scared and confused and probably angry. I am too. Derek Hastings was one of us. Many of you worked with him, respected him. And now he's done something unthinkable." The room was silent. "We're going to cooperate fully with every investigation. We're going to be transparent. And we're going to figure out how this happened so we can make sure it never happens again. I'm implementing immediate changes. Starting tomorrow, every officer in this department will undergo a mental health screening. And these screenings will happen quarterly from now on. If you're struggling, if you're dealing with stress or anxiety or depression, you need to speak up. There will be no stigma, no punishment. We're here to help each other." It was a good speech, but Stevens knew it wasn't enough. The damage was done. Trust had been broken, and it would take years to rebuild it, if it could be rebuilt at all. Meanwhile, across town in her hospital room, Keisha was trying to process everything. Her sister had brought her phone, and despite everyone telling her not to, she'd looked at the news coverage. Her face was everywhere. Her name was trending on social media. Everyone was talking about what happened to her, speculating, offering opinions, turning her trauma into a national conversation. She turned off her phone and stared at the ceiling. Her shoulder throbbed despite the pain medication. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological weight of what she'd survived. She'd walked into a courthouse for a custody hearing. That's all. By the next morning, the story had exploded beyond Memphis. It was on every national news channel, every website, every social media platform. Officer shoots woman in courthouse competed for headline space with variations like "Black woman shot during custody hearing" and "Police violence reaches new low." Keisha woke up in her hospital bed to find her phone flooded with messages. Hundreds of them. Friends, distant relatives, people she hadn't talked to in years, all reaching out. Some offered prayers and support. Others wanted details she couldn't give. A few were from reporters asking for exclusive interviews. Her sister, who'd spent the night sleeping in the uncomfortable chair by her bed, was already awake and scrolling through her own phone. "You need to see this," she said hesitantly. "There's a protest happening. Right now. At the courthouse." Keisha took the phone with her good hand. The video showed hundreds of people gathered on the courthouse steps. They were holding signs. "Justice for Keisha. Protect Black women. Who guards us from the guards?" The crowd was chanting something she couldn't quite make out through the phone speaker. "When did this start?" Keisha asked, her voice still rough from sleep and medication. "About 2 hours ago. It started small, but it's growing. There are civil rights groups there, community organizers, just regular people who are angry about what happened to you." Keisha didn't know how to feel. She was touched that people cared, but she also felt overwhelmed. She hadn't asked to become a symbol of anything. She just wanted to go home and hug her kids. The protest downtown was indeed growing by the hour. What had started as maybe 50 people at dawn had swollen to several hundred by mid-morning. Local pastors were there, speaking through megaphones about justice and accountability. Community leaders were giving interviews to every news crew that showed up. Reverend Jonathan Price, a well-known civil rights advocate in Memphis, stood on the courthouse steps addressing the crowd. "This is not just about one woman, though we thank God that Keisha Morrison survived," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This is about a system that allows armed officers to work while they're clearly in crisis. This is about a system that fails to protect Black women time and time again. This is about accountability." The crowd roared its agreement. Not everyone was sympathetic, though. Online, the comment sections were already filling with the usual arguments. Some people immediately started looking for reasons to blame Keisha. What was she doing that made the officer react that way? Was she threatening? Was she aggressive? The fact that she'd raised her voice during the hearing got twisted into she was being combative and she was creating a disturbance. People who hadn't been there, who hadn't seen the security footage, were making up their own versions of events to fit their worldview. But the evidence was too clear to ignore. The security footage had been leaked to the press, probably by someone in the investigation who wanted the truth out there. News stations were playing it, though most added warnings about disturbing content. Millions of people watched a uniformed officer walk up behind an unsuspecting woman and open fire. There was no ambiguity, no threat, no justification, just violence. The footage changed the narrative. Even people who usually gave police the benefit of the doubt in these situations couldn't find a way to defend this. The support for Keisha grew stronger. By noon, protests had spread to other cities. Small gatherings in Nashville, Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, people holding signs with Keisha's name. It was becoming part of a larger conversation about police violence, about mental health, about systemic failures. National civil rights organizations issued statements. The NICP called for a complete overhaul of how police departments handle officer mental health. Other groups demanded federal investigations into courthouse security protocols across the country. Politicians started weighing in, because that's what politicians do when something becomes a national story. Some called for justice and reform. Others cautioned against rushing to judgment before all the facts were known, even though the facts were pretty clearly established already. In Washington, a representative from Tennessee stood on the floor of Congress and told Keisha's story, using it to support legislation about police accountability that had been stalled for months. Back in Memphis, Keisha's lawyer Patricia was holding a press conference at the hospital. The hospital administration had set up a room for it, knowing they couldn't avoid the media circus. Patricia stood at a podium with microphones from every major network pointed at her. "My client, Keisha Morrison, is recovering from her physical wounds," Patricia began, reading from a prepared statement. "But the psychological trauma of this attack will take much longer to heal. She came to court that day to fight for her children. She is a dedicated mother, a beloved teacher, and a contributing member of this community. She did absolutely nothing to provoke or justify what happened to her." Reporters shouted questions over each other. Is she going to sue? Does she feel safe with police officers now? What does she want to see happen to the officer? Patricia held up a hand. Ms. Morrison will speak publicly when she's ready and not before. Right now she needs time to heal and to be with her family. But I will say this. What happened to her was not an isolated incident caused by one bad officer. It was a system failure. An officer in crisis was allowed to carry a weapon and work in public spaces with no intervention, no support, no oversight. That has to change. She took a few questions before ending the press conference, but she was careful not to say too much. There would be legal proceedings, and everything said now could affect those. Meanwhile, the Memphis Police Department was drowning in criticism from all sides. The mayor called for the police chief's resignation. The city council announced emergency hearings. Internal Affairs was overwhelmed with complaints, not just about this incident, but about other concerns that people suddenly felt comfortable reporting. The police union put out a statement defending Hastings, saying he'd been a dedicated officer for 20 years and clearly needed help, not condemnation. The statement was poorly received. People didn't want to hear about how sad it was for the officer. They wanted to know why nobody protected Keisha from him. At the hospital, Keisha was finally allowed to see her children. Her sister brought them during visiting hours, both of them scared and confused. 9-year-old Maya had been crying. 7-year-old Jordan kept asking if his mom was going to die. "Come here, babies," Keisha said, trying to smile through her own tears. She couldn't hug them properly with one arm in a sling, but she held them as close as she could with her good arm. "Mommy, what happened?" Maya asked, her voice small and frightened. How do you explain something like this to children? How do you tell them that a police officer, someone they'd been taught to trust, had tried to hurt their mother? "There was an accident at the courthouse," Keisha said carefully. "But I'm okay. I'm going to be fine. The doctors are taking good care of me." "But why is everyone talking about it on TV?" Jordan asked. "Everyone at school was talking about you. Because sometimes bad things happen and people want to make sure they don't happen again. But you don't need to worry about that. You just need to know that Mommy is safe and I love you both so much." They stayed for an hour, the kids eventually relaxing enough to tell her about school, about their friends, about normal kid stuff. It was exactly what Keisha needed. A reminder that beyond all the news coverage and protests and investigations, she had a real life with real people who loved her. After they left, she felt exhausted but also more grounded. She wasn't just a news story or a hashtag or a symbol. She was a mom. And she needed to get better for her kids. That evening, another development shocked everyone. A former colleague of Hastings came forward to the media with a disturbing claim. About a year ago, he said, Hastings had made concerning comments about people who don't respect the system and how someone needs to teach them lessons. The former colleague, who'd left the department over unrelated issues, said he'd reported those comments to a supervisor at the time, but nothing was done. "I was told Derek was just blowing off steam," the former officer said in an interview. But looking back now, knowing what he did, those comments were warning signs. And they were ignored. The department immediately denied receiving any such report, but the damage was done. More questions. More doubt. More anger. The pressure was mounting from every direction. The public wanted answers. Keisha wanted justice. The department wanted to contain the crisis. And somewhere in a psychiatric hospital, Derek Hastings sat in a room, still mostly unresponsive, seemingly unaware of the firestorm his actions had created. As night fell on Memphis, the protests continued. Candles were lit on the courthouse steps. People took turns telling stories about their own experiences with police violence, with system failures, with feeling unprotected by the very people sworn to protect them. And in her hospital room, Keisha lay awake long into the night, listening to the machines beep, feeling the ache in her shoulder, and wondering how her life had become this strange, painful, public thing. She'd wanted justice for her custody case. Instead, she'd become part of something much bigger. A conversation about safety and accountability and systemic change that she never asked to lead but couldn't escape. 4 months later, autumn had settled over Memphis. The leaves were turning gold and red, and there was a crisp edge to the morning air. But inside the criminal courthouse, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Derek Hastings was on trial. After months of psychiatric evaluation, legal debates, and motions from both sides, the case was finally before a jury. 12 people would decide his fate. The courthouse had become a fortress. Extra security everywhere, metal detectors at every entrance, officers patrolling the hallways. Nobody was taking any chances after what happened last time. Keisha sat in the front row of the gallery with her sister beside her. She'd been dreading this day for months, seeing Hastings again, reliving that terrible morning, having to tell her story in front of strangers and cameras. She'd gotten better physically. The wound had healed, though it left a scar she'd carry forever. Physical therapy had helped restore most of her range of motion, but the psychological scars were deeper and harder to heal. She still had nightmares. Sudden noises made her jump. She couldn't walk past a police officer without her heart racing. The kids had nightmares too. Her daughter had started seeing a therapist. So had Keisha. The courtroom filled up quickly. Media from across the country. Civil rights activists. Police officers showing support for their former colleague. Curious members of the public who'd been following the case. Every seat was taken. Hastings was brought in wearing civilian clothes, not his uniform. He looked different from his mugshot. Thinner, grayer, older. He kept his eyes down as he sat at the defense table with his lawyers. The prosecution team was led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a tough prosecutor known for handling high-profile cases. The defense had brought in a specialist from Nashville, a lawyer named Howard Chen who'd made a career defending officers accused of misconduct. Judge Raymond Foster entered, and everyone stood. He was a no-nonsense judge with a reputation for running a tight courtroom. He'd made clear from the beginning that he wouldn't tolerate any disruptions or theatrics from either side. "Let's proceed," Judge Foster said after everyone was seated. "Ms. Walsh, your opening statement." Walsh stood and approached the jury. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a professional dark suit, her posture confident but not arrogant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the facts of this case are not in dispute. You will see security footage showing exactly what happened on the morning of September 14th. You will watch a police officer, Derek Hastings, walk into a courtroom and shoot an unarmed woman. Not in self-defense, not by accident, not during a dangerous confrontation. He simply walked up behind Keisha Morrison and fired his weapon at her 3 times. The jury was listening intently, some of them already looking uncomfortable. The defense will tell you that Mr. Hastings was not in his right mind, that he experienced a mental breakdown. And you know what? They're right, he did. But that doesn't change what he did. He pulled the trigger. He made the choice to pick up his weapon and use it against an innocent woman, and under our law he must be held accountable for that choice." Walsh spoke for 15 more minutes, laying out the case systematically, the evidence they'd present, the witnesses they'd call, the undeniable facts that would prove attempted murder and aggravated assault. When it was the defense's turn, Howard Chen stood slowly. He was an older man with silver hair and a gentle manner that contrasted sharply with Walsh's directness. "This is a tragedy," he began. "Make no mistake about that. What happened to Ms. Morrison was terrible, and my client will carry the weight of that for the rest of his life. But this is not a case about a violent criminal who intended to kill someone. This is a case about a man who broke, completely and utterly broke." Chen walked the jury through Hastings' background. 20 years of service without a single violent incident. Commendations for bravery. Thank you letters from citizens he'd helped. A decorated career. And then life fell apart, Chen continued. His marriage ended badly. Financial ruin followed. Depression set in. He was prescribed medication but couldn't afford to keep taking it. He needed help desperately, but he worked in a system that stigmatizes mental health issues. Officers are supposed to be strong, always in control. Admitting you need help feels like admitting weakness. Several jurors nodded slightly, seeming to understand that point. The morning of September 14th, Derek Hastings was not Derek Hastings anymore. He was a shell of himself, experiencing a complete psychotic break from reality. 3 separate psychiatrists will testify that he was not capable of forming the intent required for attempted murder. He was not in control of his actions. This is a case about mental illness, not criminal intent. The opening statement set the tone for what everyone knew would be a complicated trial. The facts weren't in question. The question was whether Hastings could be held fully responsible given his mental state. The prosecution's case moved quickly. They played the security footage on a big screen for the jury. Even though everyone had seen it on the news, watching it in court hit differently. The silence in the courtroom was absolute except for the sounds from the video. The gunshots, the screaming. Keisha watched herself get shot, watched herself fall. She felt her sister's hand grip hers tightly. She kept her face as neutral as she could, but inside she was reliving every second of that terror. Witnesses testified next. Officer Wilson, the bailiff who'd tackled Hastings, described the scene. The paramedics who'd treated Keisha explained her injuries. The investigators laid out the evidence systematically, and then it was Keisha's turn to take the stand. She walked up on shaky legs, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Her left arm still had limited mobility, a constant reminder of that day. Walsh asked her to describe what happened. Keisha took a deep breath and began. I was at the courthouse for a custody hearing. It was supposed to be routine. There was a recess and I was sitting at the table reviewing my notes. The next thing I knew, my lawyer was screaming. I turned and saw a gun pointed at me. Then there was an explosion of sound and pain. I thought I was going to die right there. Her voice wavered, but she kept going. She described the fear, the confusion, the blood. She talked about how even now, months later, she couldn't feel completely safe anywhere. I used to trust police officers, she said. I taught my kids to go to officers if they ever needed help. Now I'm afraid when I see them. My children are afraid. That trust is broken and I don't know if it'll ever come back. The defense's cross-examination was gentle. Chen wasn't trying to attack her or suggest she'd done anything wrong. He only wanted to establish that she'd never met Hastings before, never had any interaction with him, that she was a complete stranger to him. So there was no reason for my client to target you specifically, Chen asked. No, Keisha said. I don't understand why he did it. I'll probably never understand. The prosecution rested their case after 3 days. The evidence was overwhelming. Nobody disputed that Hastings had shot Keisha without provocation. Then the defense began presenting their case, and the courtroom atmosphere shifted. They weren't trying to deny what happened. They were trying to explain it. 3 psychiatrists testified, each one explaining Hastings' mental state. They used terms like acute psychotic episode and complete dissociation from reality. They showed brain scans and test results. They painted a picture of a man whose mind had essentially shattered under pressure. When someone experiences a break this severe, one psychiatrist explained, they're not operating in the same reality we are. Mr. Hastings believed he was doing something necessary, though he can't articulate what that was even now. His actions that day were driven by delusion, not criminal intent. The prosecution challenged this aggressively. Walsh brought in her own experts who argued that mental illness doesn't completely eliminate responsibility, that Hastings still made choices, still had some level of awareness. The most damaging testimony for the defense came from Detective Rodriguez, who'd investigated the case. She laid out all the warning signs that had been ignored. Mr. Hastings showed multiple signs of declining mental health in the weeks before the shooting. Rodriguez testified. Behavioral changes, emotional outbursts, reported concerns from colleagues and civilians. None of it was documented properly. None of it was addressed. The system failed both Mr. Hastings and Ms. Morrison. That testimony hit hard. It wasn't just about Hastings' guilt or innocence. It was about a system that allowed a man in crisis to carry a weapon and work in public spaces with no intervention. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Both sides made their closing arguments. Walsh reminded the jury that mental illness doesn't excuse violence, that Hastings had to be held accountable. Chen pleaded for mercy, for understanding that his client was sick, not evil. Then the jury got the case. They deliberated for 3 days, 3 agonizing days where Keisha couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function. Everything hung on what 12 strangers decided. On the 3rd day, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again. Keisha sat in the same seat, her heart pounding. Hastings was brought back in, looking pale and drawn. The jury filed in, none of them making eye contact with anyone. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Foster asked. We have, Your Honor, the forewoman said, standing. The sentencing hearing came 6 weeks after the verdict. Judge Foster had reviewed all the pre-sentencing reports, the victim impact statements, the psychological evaluations. Now he had to decide how long Derek Hastings would spend in prison. The courtroom was packed again. This was the final chapter of the criminal case, and everyone wanted to see how it ended. Keisha was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. She'd written and rewritten it a dozen times, never quite finding the right words. How do you sum up the impact of something like this? How do you quantify trauma? She stood at the podium, her prepared statement in her shaking hands. Your Honor, on September 14th, I went to court to fight for my children. Instead, I had to fight for my life. In the seconds it took for Officer Hastings to pull his trigger, my entire world changed. The physical wound healed in weeks. The psychological wounds may never fully heal. She paused, looking at the judge. I don't sleep well anymore. When I do sleep, I have nightmares. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. I jump at sudden sounds. My children are scared. They don't understand why a police officer hurt their mother. They don't feel safe anymore. Neither do I. Her voice got stronger as she continued. But I also know that Derek Hastings was suffering too. He was crying out for help in his own way, and nobody heard him. Nobody intervened. The system that was supposed to support him failed. And because of that failure, both of our lives were destroyed. She looked directly at Hastings for the first time during the whole trial process. He was looking at her too, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes. Recognition. Remorse. Grief for what he'd done. "I want justice," Keisha said, "but I also want change. I want a system where officers get the help they need before they reach a breaking point. I want mental health to be treated as seriously as physical health. I want no other person to go through what I went through." She folded her statement and returned to her seat. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Hastings' lawyers had their turn. They pleaded for leniency, emphasizing his mental illness, his previous good record, his remorse. Hastings himself stood and spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't explain what happened that day. I don't remember thinking or deciding anything. It's like watching someone else do something terrible in a dream, but it was me. I did that. And I have to live with it forever." He turned slightly toward Keisha. "Ms. Morrison, I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it. I destroyed your sense of safety. I hurt you and your family. I violated everything I swore to protect. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that if I could undo it, if I could take it all back, I would. I'm so deeply sorry." Judge Foster listened to everything, then took a recess to consider the sentence. When he returned an hour later, his expression was grave. "Mr. Hastings, you were convicted by a jury of attempted murder and aggravated assault. The evidence showed clearly that you shot Ms. Morrison without provocation or justification. While I acknowledge your mental health crisis, I also recognize that you had opportunities to seek help and chose not to. Your actions endangered not just Ms. Morrison, but everyone in that courtroom." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "However, I also recognize that this case represents a systemic failure. An officer in crisis was allowed to continue working with no intervention, no support, no oversight. That failure contributed to this tragedy. With that in mind, I sentence you to 20 years in the state penitentiary, with the possibility of parole after serving 15 years. You will also be required to undergo ongoing mental health treatment throughout your incarceration." 20 years. Hastings nodded slowly as if he'd expected it. His lawyers immediately indicated they'd be filing appeals, as everyone knew they would. But the criminal case was essentially over. Hastings was led away in handcuffs, and that chapter closed. The next chapter was the civil lawsuit. Keisha and Patricia had filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Memphis Police Department, the county, and the courthouse security system. They weren't just seeking compensation for Keisha. They were seeking to force systemic changes. The lawsuit detailed every failure that led to the shooting: the lack of mental health screening, the ignored warning signs, the absence of protocols for monitoring officers in crisis, the inadequate training for recognizing and responding to colleague distress. The legal proceedings took another 8 months. Depositions, discovery, negotiations. The department fought hard at first, but the evidence was too damning. They'd failed in multiple ways, and their own internal investigation had confirmed it. Eventually, they reached a settlement. $4.2 million to Keisha and her family, but more importantly, a consent decree requiring major policy changes. The Memphis Police Department agreed to implement quarterly mental health screenings for all officers. They agreed to create a confidential reporting system for concerns about colleague behavior. They agreed to hire additional mental health professionals to support officers. They agreed to eliminate the stigma around seeking help by making counseling a normal, expected part of the job. These changes wouldn't just affect Memphis. Other departments across Tennessee and beyond were watching. Some started implementing similar policies voluntarily, not wanting to face their own tragedy. Meanwhile, Keisha's life was slowly rebuilding. The settlement money meant she didn't have to worry about finances while she healed. She took a year off from teaching, focusing on her own recovery and her children's well-being. She started therapy regularly. So did her kids. They worked through their trauma together as a family. The nightmares became less frequent. The fear started to ease, though it never completely went away. Her custody case had been resolved months ago, almost forgotten in the chaos of everything else. The family court judge, having watched Keisha handle the most traumatic experience imaginable with grace and strength, awarded her full custody. Her ex-husband had visitation rights, but there was no question about who the children belonged with. But Keisha discovered something unexpected during her recovery. She had a voice that people wanted to hear. People who'd gone through their own trauma, their own encounters with system failures, reached out to her. She started speaking at events, sharing her story not for attention but to push for change. She connected with state legislators who were working on police reform bills. She testified before committees, sharing her experience and advocating for better mental health support for officers. "This isn't about being anti-police," she told one committee. "This is about being pro-everyone. Officers need support systems that keep them healthy. The public needs to know that the people protecting them are mentally fit for duty. These goals aren't in conflict. They're the same goal approached from different angles." A year and a half after the shooting, a piece of legislation was introduced in the Tennessee State House. It was informally called Keisha's Law by supporters. The official title was longer and more bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. The law would require all armed law enforcement officers in Tennessee to undergo quarterly mental health evaluations. It would mandate paid mental health days for officers showing signs of stress or burnout. It would create a confidential statewide system for reporting concerns about officer well-being. It would provide funding for departments to hire counselors and mental health professionals. The law faced opposition. Some argued it was too expensive. Others worried about privacy concerns. Police unions had mixed feelings, some supporting the mental health benefits while others saw it as unnecessary oversight. But Keisha kept speaking. She appeared at town halls, on local news programs, at legislative hearings. She told her story over and over, never letting people forget what happens when mental health is ignored. "Derek Hastings wasn't a monster," she said in one interview. "He was a man who needed help and didn't get it. And I'm the one who paid the price. But we can prevent this. We can create systems that catch people before they break. We can save officers and civilians both." The law passed 18 months after it was introduced. It wasn't perfect. There were compromises and amendments. But it was real change, written into state law requiring action. On the day it was signed by the governor, Keisha stood behind him as he put pen to paper. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Keisha just stood there quietly, thinking about that September morning that had changed everything. She'd gone to court to fight for her children. She'd never imagined she'd end up fighting for something much bigger. But here she was. 2 years after the shooting, Keisha returned to teaching. She'd missed it. Missed the kids. Missed the routine of classroom life. Her students that first day back were curious but respectful. They'd been told their teacher had been away because she'd been hurt. But they didn't know the details. She didn't tell them. She just focused on teaching, on being present, on helping these young minds grow and learn. It felt good to have normal back in her life. She still carried the scar on her shoulder. She still had moments of anxiety when she saw police officers. She still had occasional nightmares. The trauma hadn't disappeared just because she'd gotten justice and pushed for change.